about a man, first among the legend of his land. And to update us, ladies and gentlemen, on this current state of affairs in the Philippines and his future plans, may I now present to you, ladies and gentlemen, the inspiration of freedom-loving citizens of the world and the inspiration of the Filipino people, Ninoy Aquino.
Mr. Danny Lamila, my dear friend Serge Osmeña, Mr. Alvarez, my brothers and sisters. I am filled with happiness to be with you here this afternoon, because this is the first experience in my life. For the last 25 years, I have been a politician. We used to pay people to hear us. This is the first time people paid to hear me. As I was sitting down there, listening to Danny Lamila, I only have one advice to him. Don't ever go back to Manila or you'll be a captured eagle. I was asked why I am in crutches. Is it because of my heart operation? The answer is no. I was already running 2 miles 4 months after my operation. I was already very good, and my wife can attest to that. But unfortunately, last December 6, I was invited to Columbus, Ohio. And they made me speak in so many areas that day. I barely had 3 hours sleep the night before when I came from Cornell in Ithaca, New York. I had to fly back to Boston to meet my doctor who came in from Dallas. I took him out for dinner and we slept at about 2 o'clock in the morning. I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning. I drove to the airport. I went to Columbus, Ohio. I arrived in Columbus, Ohio, and the moment I arrived there, they made me speak in 3 different occasions. Finally, on the 4th speaking engagement that day, we were headed towards the Ohio State University where I was going to speak before the student body. It was almost 8:30. It was very dark where the van I was riding in parked. And when I alighted from the van, I do not know exactly what happened, but I think I stepped on a curb. And then when I put my weight, I slipped. And little did I realize that that single half-a-second accident tore my Achilles heel tendon, and I had to go for an operation after 5 days, and I've been in a cast for 8 weeks, and I've been out of a cast now for 2 weeks, and hopefully in another 2 weeks I'll be up and about. I have been asked by many people, what is the actual situation in the Philippines? I think I owe it to a Japanese executive, one of the leading industrialists of Japan, whose company invested $450 million in the Philippines. They set up a big plant in Mindanao. It was a sintering plant, and this plant is now completed, and this Japanese official came to the Philippines, and he spoke at the opening ceremonies. I think this Japanese explained the situation in the Philippines very well. As you very well know, the Japanese have a difficulty pronouncing their R's. Manila becomes Manira. I say, our situation today may be likened to the story of a fellow candidate of mine during Laban. As you very well know, we fielded a team in 1978 to oppose the Marcos team, and I was in jail, and I was never allowed to campaign, but there were 20 other gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, campaigning for us. One of them was the irrepressible former Secretary of Education, Anding Roses. And Anding Roses had a very favorite candidate, or had a very favorite personality in all of his speeches, and he called him Escombro. According to Anding, and this is a story of Escombro, Mr. Marcos one day wanted to go to the National Mental Institution, to the psychopathic, to visit the psychopathic. And naturally, the doctor of the psychopathic wanted to impress Mr. Marcos, and 3 weeks before Mr. Marcos arrived, all the patients of the psychopathic, according to Escombro, were trained by the director. And so, according to the story, the director trained them. Pagdating ika dito ng ating panggulo, pagtaas ng aking isang daliri, kang ganun, palakpakan. And so 1 week they trained them. The director would lift one finger, palakpakan. On the second week, pag ikang ganun, dalawa na, palakpakan at sigawan. So, the patients responded, 2 fingers, palakpakan, sigawan. On the third week, just before Mr. Marcos arrived, pag isang finger, kang ganun, palakpakan. 2 finger, palakpakan, sigawan. Pag 3 finger, palakpakan, sigawan, talunan pa. And so the patients responded. And the great day arrived, and Mr. Marcos came. The military escorts came, 5,000 inmates of the hospital were there, and they were all dressed immaculately in white, and the director, walking behind Mr. Marcos, lift 1 finger. Naku, palakpakan! And Mr. Marcos saluted. As they were going to the middle of the auditorium, the director paid 2 finger. Naku, palakpakan, sigawan pa! Sabi ni Marcos, okay ito ah. And as they entered the main stage, as Mr. Marcos was about to sit down, sabi ng director, 3. Naku, palakpakan, sigawan, talunan pa. And Mr. Marcos, nodding, sabi niya kay director, ayos ka na, director. Doble na ang inyong budget. But as Mr. Marcos sat down, he noticed there was an old man sitting in a corner. Walang kibo. He was just sitting in the corner. And so naturally, the president wanted to know. Sabi niya, director, bakit ikaw yung matandang yon? Hindi pumapalakpak, hindi sumisigaw, hindi tumatalon. Ang sabi po ng direktor, Pangulo kang ganon, mabuti na po yan, he's already okay, lalabas na bukas, pag di bali na. Kanya po, sa ating mga kababayan na nandito sa Los Angeles, na pag nakikita ang larawan ng Ginong Marcos at sila'y nasa ludo pa at napalakpak, huwag niyo sanang kalimutan yung mga kasama niyo sa National Psychopathic Hospital. Sapagkat kaming hindi na napalakpak, ay kami po'y magaling na at kami palabas na. And so, dear friends, I was allowed by Mr. Marcos to go out for 2 weeks last year on Christmas after 7 years in prison. And I met an old barrio captain of mine from Tarlac. And this old barrio captain of mine never failed to give me a sage advice. He visited me, we broke bread, and then I sat down with him and I said, Apo ka kung ganon, ito ba'y may katapusan na? May katapusan pa ba ito? Bakit? Sabi niya. Ako kakoy, inip na eh. I'm very, very impatient. I said, I've already spent 7 years. Is there any hope for our redemption? Hindi ko nga ikaalam anak kung matatapos to. Napakatagal na malapit na akong mamatay Hindi pa natatapos. Pero alam mo ikang ganon, palagay ko matatapos din. Ikaw ko bakit? What is your reason? Abay sabi niya, doon sa Iran ay merong isang tunay na Shah na tapos. Itong atin, nasyahan lamang. And I feel, my friends, as the Tagalog would say, kay haba-haba ng prosesyon sa simbahan din ang tuloy, this will also end. I have often asked myself, when I was in prison for 7 years and 7 months, you will note that one of the greatest problem of a prisoner is loneliness. For 7 years, I was not allowed to see the moon and the stars. There were days where they left me all alone by myself. I had no reading material. I had nothing. I was twiddling my thumb. I would walk and walk and walk across my room. Just a room of about 4 meters by 5 meters. Hoping that I'll get tired. And then when I get tired, I will fall asleep. Knowing that tomorrow will be the same. And I often ask myself, bakit ka pa nagpapakahirap dito? In 73, a high official of the government asked me, endorse mo na lamang ang New Society, Ninoy, ayos na, ilalabas na kita. When I refused, they advised me, sumulat ka na lang kay Marcos, ask for his forgiveness. O ano naman ka kung kasalanan ko, siya nagkasala sa bayan, bakit akong hihingi ng tawad? My friends, I cannot understand the temerity and the gall of these people. Kang ganon, be practical. Talagang ganon makibagay ka na napakalakas ka ng bagyo Ikaw lang ka mahihirapan diyan. Mag-isa ka dyan. Hindi balik ang ganon. Kung ayaw mo nang sumulat, tumawag ka na lang sa telepono, ibulong mo na lamang, ayos na. I would like to tell you that I was tempted in my almost 7,285 days in prison to do just that. I am only human. Ako po isang tao lamang. When my wife and children would visit me and they would leave me at dusk after 1 hour, I also would like to enjoy the embrace of my children and the peace of my home. But if I gave faith in that conviction, if I refused to accept the jurisdiction of a military court, and because I refuse to defend myself, they will give me the death sentence, I vowed to myself that because you have elected me to the Senate and I gloried in its pomp, therefore it is now time that I must suffer the consequences of my act. And because I knew early on, and I discovered that there is a God who is just, na merong isang Panginoon na ibibigay sa atin ang ating kagandahang ginawa at paparusahin tayo sa ating kamaliang nagawa rin. It is because of that faith in my divine Creator that sustained me all these years. All I had to do was call for a telephone that was outside my room. All I had to do was pick it up and tell Mr. Marcos, Brad, tapos na, ayos na, I'm throwing the towel. Killers in the Philippines were freed. The people who were used to testify against me told the court, I killed 50 people. And yet that man was free. He described to the people and he described to the military tribunal how he killed human beings. And yet that man was free. And I was in jail. Many witnesses were paraded before me. I never saw them in my life. And yet they were pointing fingers at me, accusing me of crimes I never committed. They admitted to crimes. They said they were communists. They said they were number 3 in the communist hierarchy. And yet the government set them free, and I was in jail. But I knew that somehow I will regain my freedom. Maybe not in this world, but elsewhere. And I knew that sometime, somewhere, Mr. Marcos and I will meet. And in that meeting, I will have my satisfaction. Dear friends, last January 17, Mr. Marcos told the world, martial law has been lifted in the Philippines. It was a very good news. I mean, if you're only reading the headlines, you would say, this is the greatest thing that happened. After 8 years, martial law is lifted. Freedom should be returned by now. And the Filipino people should be out in the street, like BJ Day, like BE Day. They should be dancing in the street. They'd be shouting hallelujah. And the bell should be ringing Te Deum. But the announcement of Mr. Marcos was met with stony silence. Why? Because it was only a cruel deception. Because 3 days before martial law was lifted, allegedly in the Philippines, Mr. Marcos signed into a law, Presidential Decree number 1737. I did not know about this law until Senator Tañada came to me in Boston and gave me this law. And when I saw the number, I was stunned and I had cold chills in my back. It was Presidential Decree number 1737, and this is exactly the address of my office in Harvard, 1737 Cambridge Street. Ako po ininervyos. Hayop pa ako sa dami ng numerong kombinasyon, ito pang tinamaan ng sweepstake. Hindi ko man nalaman kung isinadya ito sa Manila, ngunit ito po hindi nagpatulog sa akin ng 1 linggo. Sapagkat this presidential decree says, an act providing for the preservation of public order and the protection of individual rights and liberties during periods of emergency and exercise of extraordinary executive powers. Signed by Marcos a few days before martial law. Now let me read to you section number 2, and I hope Danny Lamila hears this very well. Section 2 says, and I quote, whenever in the judgment of the President, Prime Minister, yan po si Marcos yan, President at Prime Minister, there exists a grave danger or a threat or imminence thereof, he, Mr. Marcos, may issue such orders as he may deem necessary to meet the emergency, including but not limited to preventive detention. Ano pong ibig sabihin itong preventive detention? The meaning of preventive detention is, if Mr. Marcos thinks that next month you will commit a crime, he can now order you arrested so you will not be able to commit your crime. Anong klaseng batas yan? Iniisip mo pa lang, nabilanggo ka na eh. Abay, hayop pa ako itong batas na ito. Eh kung totoo ito, lahat ng lalaki diborsyada na, nag-iisip pa lang magliligaw, patay na sa asawa. Imagine, my friends, if in the mind of Mr. Marcos, he suspects that next week you may commit a crime, the police can arrest you in the Philippines today. Let me proceed. If in the mind of Mr. Marcos, you pose a grave threat to national security, he may restrain or restrict your movement and other activities of persons or entities with a view to preventing them from acting in a manner prejudicial to the national interest or security or maintenance of public order. He may direct the closure of any publication or other media of mass communication he may believe to be subversive, banning or regulating the holding of entertainment or exhibitions detrimental to the national interest, control admission to educational institutions whose operations are found prejudicial to the national security. If there are many students who want to demonstrate, and that in his mind is prejudicial to national security, he may close the school or prevent those students from enrolling in those schools. And my friends, any violation of this law entails an imprisonment for not less than 30 days and not exceeding 1 year. So you have Mr. Marcos lifting martial law on one hand and putting another law in the other, which is even worse than the former martial law. This therefore summarizes me to our point. Ano baga ang ating away? What is the cause for all of this struggle? Very succinctly, I believe that no man, how brilliant this man, can dictate the welfare or the direction of 48 million Filipinos. What happened to us? I think we should review what happened to us. In 1972, Mr. Marcos declared martial law. Why did he declare martial law? If you read his pronouncement, he said there was anarchy in the street, there was a left and right rebellion, there was this and there was that. But there is only one reason, which he never said. He wanted to prolong his stay in Malacanang sapagkat napakasarap. You very well know that we have a law in the Philippines that says no president may stay in the presidency for more than 8 consecutive years. That is a law. That is a law even ahead of the United States law. No president may stay for more than 8 years. In 1972, Mr. Marcos was already 7 years in office. He had 1 year to go. He was toying with the idea of fielding Imelda, but Imelda showed very poor in the polls. So what did Mr. Marcos do? Change the Constitution, sabi niya. So he called the Constitutional Convention in 1970. We were a handful in the Senate who denounced this, and I told the Senate, we should not allow an open Constitutional Convention because it's very dangerous. Even America, I said, has never called the Constitutional Convention since 1776. They have amended their Constitution piecemeal, but they never opened it. But we lost, and a Constitutional Convention was called. People were elected. And very quietly, Mr. Marcos started maneuvering to change our form of government from an American-type presidential system to a British-type parliamentary so that he can be elected as a deputy from Ilocos, become prime minister, and then stay on forever. That was the plan. However, on January 2, 1972, most of you are already here in America. Some of you maybe were too young to remember. But on January 1972, almost 9 years ago today, an old man, a retired ambassador from Leyte, his name is Eduardo Quintero, who is now in San Francisco, stood up on the floor of the Constitutional Convention and shocked the entire Filipino people with the expose that Malacanang has been giving envelopes to members of the Constitutional Convention, buying their votes so that they will vote for a parliamentary form of government to allow Mr. Marcos to extend his term beyond the 8 years. The nation was shocked. Immediately, the NBI swooped down into the house of Quintero, and then they opened up an aparador, walang susi, and they said 500,000 pesos in cash were found in the aparador of Quintero. The implication was the opposition gave him 500,000 to make his expose. But if there were 500,000, bakit walang susi yon? Hindi naman 50 pesos lang yon. To cut a long story short, a delegate from Cebu, his name is Napoleon Ram, stood up on the convention floor and said, "Wag na tayo magtalo. Let us not discuss who received or who did not receive. I am now filing a resolution that will provide, if we approve this constitutional convention, this constitutional amendment, this new constitution, no incumbent president or his spouse may seek office." Out sa kulumbo si Mr. Marcos. Eh sa takot ng mga delegado, because they will be accused if they voted no, that they received the envelope, everybody voted yes. Nalagot si Mr. Marcos. This Rama resolution was overwhelmingly passed. Mr. Marcos and Imelda Marcos are out of the running. So what will Mr. Marcos do? Hindi na pwede sa 1935 Constitution. Hindi na po pwede dito sa bagong Constitution. The only reason left, or the only excuse and the only option left for Mr. Marcos is to declare martial law. And so what happened? The students demonstrated in the streets. Sabi ng agent ni Marcos, sige pa, dagdagan pa nyo. More demonstration in the street. Sige pa. Finally, bombings started in Manila. And did you know, my friends, the Manila police captured one of the bombers. And one of these bombers in Manila was identified as a sergeant of the firearms and explosive section of the Philippine Constabulary. The following day, this man was snatched from the Manila police and we never heard from him again. And then, on September 23, midnight, Mr. Marcos went on television and said, "I, Ferdinand Marcos, acting as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, by virtue of the provision of the Constitution which states, in case of invasion, insurrection, rebellion, or imminent danger thereof, I may declare martial law or suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Therefore, I now declare martial law and shall administer this country alone." On that day, democracy died. And so Mr. Marcos arrested together with us in the Senate most of the leaders in the Constitutional Convention. All of those opposing him went to jail with us. And then when they went to jail with us, all the other members of the convention were herded and they were given a constitution made by Mr. Marcos and they were told to sign. And everybody signed, except those in jail with us. And once this new constitution was signed by them, he released the delegates. And then on January 17, 1973, Mr. Marcos went on television and said, "Ladies and gentlemen and my countrymen, there is now a new constitution." But how can we have a new constitution? There was no plebiscite. You know that the law says before you can have a new constitution, you must present it to the Filipino people, and the Filipino people must, in a secret ballot, write yes or no. What happened? Tinawag ni Mr. Marcos sa mga citizens assembly. Tinawag niya mga barrio councils. And then in the middle of this meeting, tinanong, "Kayo ba'y gutom na?" "Yes." "Taas ang kamay." "Taas." Lahat ng tabas. Approve ang konstitusyon. My friends, this is not fiction. Because in the now famous Habiliana case, Habiliana versus Executive Secretary, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Habiliana went to the Supreme Court and questioned the illegality of this constitution. And what did the Supreme Court say? Out of 10 justices, 6 out of 10 said this constitution was not validly ratified. According to the 1935 Constitution and according even to the new Constitution, it was not validly ratified. But then the Supreme Court added, but there is nothing to stop it. So, we had a constitution. And so, my friends, we started with an American-type constitution. We moved to a British-type constitution. We had a parliamentary form of government without a parliament. Until 1978, we did not have a parliament. And yet, we were supposed to be a parliamentary form of government. And Mr. Marcos said, "I declared martial law to save democracy." But by saving democracy, he killed it. And so, my friends, it was not until 1978 that the Batasan was convened. Now what do we hear? Mr. Marcos once again is up again to his new tricks. He said, "I lifted martial law, but I think we should now elect a president by direct vote." But there is no such thing. Under the new constitution now, the president is purely ceremonial. Tigabukas lang ng pinto, tagatanggap lamang ng credential ng ambassador. Purely ceremonial, elected by parliament. He's not elected by the people. The power of the government under a parliamentary system rests on the prime minister, and the prime minister must be elected by parliament, and this prime minister may be removed from office if there is a vote of no confidence. That's the British type. So what did Mr. Marcos do in 1976? He amended the constitution and said, "I, Ferdinand Marcos, as Prime Minister, President, may dissolve Parliament, but Parliament cannot dissolve me." And then he said, "Parliament may legislate, but if I think they're not doing the job, I will also legislate." So now we have two parliaments, Mr. Marcos and Parliament. And it's costing us 300 million to have that two-top parliament. And what's the use? If Mr. Marcos is doing all the legislation, why keep these 200 guys? So what do? They change the name of the street of Divisoria. They change the name of a school. But when it comes to public decrees, like Public Order Code 1737, only Mr. Marcos signs it. And so we have a situation where we have a man who can dissolve Parliament, but Parliament cannot dissolve him. And under the amendment number 6 of the 1973 Constitution, Mr. Marcos is a president for life. And now, all of a sudden, 2 weeks ago, sabi niya, "I have lifted martial law, but I now want to go to the Filipino people and I want their mandate of 8 years. I will defend martial law. Anybody who's opposed it can oppose me. I want to go to the people and get their mandate." But how can you get a mandate? There's no such thing in the Constitution. Sagot ni Marcos, "Let us amend it." So now we are going to amend again the Constitution. And so we asked Mr. Marcos, "But what form of government will we have?" Sabi niya, "I want a president with powers." What happened to the parliamentary type British? Forget it. Let us now go to France. Let us have a French model. And so, my friends, It is like the Odyssey of Jules Verne, 80 days around the world. We started with America, we went to England, now we're going to France. Under the new proposal of Mr. Marcos, we will now have a president and a prime minister. But the prime minister will be appointed by the president. And this president now will be all-powerful. It will not be the American type, it will be the French type. And I suppose 2 years from now, when he gets tired of that, he will go to the Russian type, whatever that is. And so he announced, I will take anybody, including Aquino. And so, I was not inclined to oblige him, but then he added, pero sabi niya, hindi pwede si Aquino underage. And so naturally, I went to the books. I said, how come I am underage? I thought I was already 48. Because the rule before, to become president of the Philippines in 1935, all you had to do is to be 40 years old. And so I looked at the book. Tama nga naman si Marcos. They've increased the age to 50. Kapos na naman ako ng dalawa. Of course, Mr. Marcos said, pero kung talagang gusto niya Aquino, if he really wants to come home and to fight me, I will oblige him. I will also have the Constitution amended for him. So I told Mr. Marcos and his people, forget me, Mr. President. I am through with your politics. Hindi na po ako sasama sa inyong kalukuhan. Nagtayo kayo ng isang lapian, ang pangalan KBL, Kilusan ng Bagong Lipunan, mali po kako yan. Kilusan ng mga bingi at mga loko-loko. Hindi na ako sasama dyan. Ako'y tapos na. I told them, I am through with politics, I said. I would just want to live in peace now. But I wrote Mr. Marcos and I told him, while it's true, Mr. Marcos, I said, that after my 8 years in prison, I have lost appetite for office. I am no longer seeking the presidency of this land. I'm not seeking anymore any office in this country. But believe me, I said, when I tell you that while I have vowed never to enter the political arena again, I shall dedicate the last drop of my blood to the restoration of freedom and the dismantlement of your martial law. It is with this thought that I sought an audience with Mrs. Marcos last December 16. After I was released or given a medical furlough, I was in prison, as you know, for 7 years and 7 months. Then on March 18 or March 19 of 1980, while they allowed me to run and they made a little corral for me, they brought me out between 11 and 12 o'clock. Every day, they brought me out to exercise. On that particular day of March, as I was walking around my little corral, all of a sudden I developed a chest pain. And then the pain was so terrible that I sat down and I asked my guard to massage my chest and asked him to bring me back. I called for the army doctors. They checked me and they said, muscle spasm lang po yan. That's nothing. Just take a rest. And so I rested. But after 40 days, I was so weak, I could not even take a bath. I was shaking. And I told my doctor, I said, look, doctor, I don't know, I said, your diagnosis or its accuracy, but I am very, very weak. Please bring me to the Philippine Heart Center and get me an examination. That doctor, fortunately, on that morning, after 40 days, on April 10, 28, his name is Colonel Bayani Garcia, came to my office and said, yes, Senator, sabi niya, I will now recommend that they bring you to the Heart Center because apparently you're not getting well. Mr. Marcos has just arrived from Honolulu. I will make my recommendation. This is the officer who's been taking care of me for 7 years. He's a full colonel. He's the commanding officer of the Bonifacio Station Hospital. He was the one who diagnosed that I only had a muscle spasm. At 9:30 in the morning, he saw me of April 28. He left my room, and I wrote a letter, and I told them, if you do not bring me to the Heart Center, I will be constrained to appeal to the Supreme Court. And so he said, no, sir. Ako na pong bahala. I will talk to the commanding general. At 1 o'clock, that day. A knock on my door came, and I was given a letter from the commanding general. I thought it was the approval of my request. When I opened the letter, it was handwritten note, and it said, "My dear Senator Aquino, it is with deep regret that I inform you, your Dr. Colonel Bayani S. Garcia died of a massive heart attack an hour ago. If you were in my place, here is your doctor telling you it's a muscle spasm, tapos bigla siyang namatay. How would you feel?" And so, my friends, I sat down stunned, but then I wrote back to the general and I said, much as I'd like to go to the heart center, it is my request that I be kept here in my cell until my doctor is buried. Only after he's buried will I go to the heart center, I said, because in deference to him, I would like to wait for his burial. I did not realize that this doctor had a sister in Germany and a brother in Saudi Arabia, so it took 7 days before they buried him. Finally, on May 5, 1980, almost midnight, they took me from my cell and they brought me to the heart center. That was a Monday. The doctors at the heart center met me, took preliminary tests, and they told me, "Senator," they said, "tomorrow we will begin the battery of tests." And so I slept, but I could not sleep. That was the first time I was brought out of my cell in almost 7 years and 7 months. And there were beautiful nurses, and the first time I was seeing women in 7 years and 7 months. And naturally, I was watching my heart as it was palpitating. And so I woke up at 6 o'clock that following morning on a Tuesday, and they brought me down for my x-ray, and they brought me back. And there were these beautiful nurses around, and they say, "Oh, Senator, ikang ganon. Nangayayat po pala kayo." Ako, "Thank you. You know, I used to be very big." But as I sat down after that x-ray, I was just about to sip my coffee. All of a sudden, I got hit again by a terrible chest pain that was almost choking me, and my arm was getting paralyzed. So I told the nurse, I said, "Miss, please bring me to bed." So they brought me to bed, and they put all of those gadgets. And all of a sudden, the needles were squiggling. And they called the doctor. The doctor looked at the tracings, and then after 1 hour, they came back to me and said, "Mr. Senator, we are canceling all tests." I said, "Why?" "Because we already know what's wrong with you." I said, "What's wrong with me?" "You have blocked arteries, and you must undergo an emergency triple bypass, otherwise you may die in 6 days to 6 months. I told them, "Where can I have my operation?" "Dito lang po, sa heart center." And that's the heart center of Imelda Marcos. And I asked, "Who can do the operation for me?" The director said, "Ako lang po. There are 2 other assistants if you want, but I'm the only one performing in the center." He was the director of the heart center, handpicked also by Imelda. I said, "Doctor, pagpaliban mo na ka ako. Thank you na lang." I said, "If they cannot operate on me in America, please bring me to my cell." Well, the reason why I did not want to be operated in the Philippines, I have one weakness. I talk in my sleep. Kung bigyan ako ng anesthesia at nagdadadal ako ron, sabi ko, gusto kong patayin si Marcos, mamamatay na ako doon. You know, I don't know what I will say. The moment they put me on anesthesia, after all, I've been thinking of many things for the last 7 years. I might be saying many things, and the doctor will be recording that, and they said, "Bangungot na muna ito, mahasama pa lang mabuhay." But the truth is, I did not want them to touch me in Manila. And so there was a crisis. The general came to me and they said, "Well, Senator," he said, "if you don't want Dr. Aventura here, why don't you give us the name of your doctor in America and we will bring them to the Philippines. Gastos po ng gobyerno." I said, "It's too much of a hassle." "Hindi po, don't worry, we'll bring them. Name any doctor you want. We will get you operated here." I said, "No. If I cannot be operated in America, then bring me back to my cell." The Deputy Minister of Defense came to my room. He tried to talk me out of my decision. I said, "No." And so finally he said, "Are you willing to write a letter to Marcos requesting to be brought to America?" I said, "Yes." Siguro kang ganun, mas maganda kung mag-iwan ka ng 2 anak mo, parang maniwala na babalik ka. And so I wrote my letter to Mr. Marcos and made 2 covenants. That if I leave, I shall return. And two, that while in America, I shall not speak out against his regime. And I also said, I will only bring 3 of my children with me. That's also true. But of course, the other 2 were already abroad. And then, my friends, that was a Wednesday, when I wrote that letter, all of a sudden, on Thursday morning, May 8th, my wife visited me early in the morning, and she told me, the hospital is crawling with Metrocom cars. Guards all over the place. Baka kami magbibisita sa'yo. Then all of a sudden, my guards started jumping, putting their barong Tagalog, hiding all of their guns. I said, tama, may darating na VIP. And then, lo and behold, the beautiful one ascended into my suite. She came, and she was really beautiful. She has not aged, and she sat down and said, naku, Ninoy, sabi niya, I'm sorry to see you like that. Hindi ko lang nasabi sa kanya, kayo may kagagawa nito eh. At any rate, I had my bathrobe and I was like this, and she talked to me and we talked to her, and she was very nice about it. And then all of a sudden, after 1 hour, she said, would you like to go to America? Abay ka ko, sure. Oo. Sa tuwa ko, tinanggal ko pa yung aking kwintas, kako anting-anting ko ito, iwanan ko nakaprepare dito. Palayasin na niyo ako, pumunta niyo ako sa Amerika. Sabi niya, there's a plane leaving at 6 o'clock. You can be in that plane. Ay kako, thank you. And so, my friends, she ordered General Ver to instruct the Foreign Office to issue us passports. They called up the American Embassy to get us visa. My wife had to rush out to look for some money. And finally, at 2:30 in the afternoon, they brought me out of my room from the hospital, brought me to my house in a van. I never saw Manila, therefore. They gave me 30 minutes in my house to pack, to take a shower, put me back on the van, bring me to the airport, put me in a 747, and out of the Philippines. That's the story. There was no deal. There was no other considerations. And when I arrived in America, I want to tell you, I was a very sick man. I had to rest in San Francisco. When I arrived in Dallas, Texas, immediately the doctors brought me directly to the hospital and then checked me. On that Monday, May 12, they gave me an arteriogram. At 1 o'clock that day, my Filipino doctor, cardiologist, Dr. Rolando Solis, came and said, Senator, he said, I'm sorry, but you have to undergo a triple bypass. I said, Doctor, what day is today? Sabi niya, May 12. Tomorrow is May 13, hit me tomorrow. No, sabi niya, no hurry, you can do it on the 14th. I said, no, hit me tomorrow, May 13. Sabi niya, kang bahala. And so he asked me, may I know why you want the 13? My friends, in 1975, I went on a hunger strike for 40 days and 40 nights. On May 5, 1975, my blood pressure dropped 60/40 and they could hardly feel my heartbeat and I had no pulse. And they rushed me to the Veterans Memorial Hospital. On May 13, 1975, on the 40th day of my fast, and that was my pact with my Lord, that I will go for 40 days and 40 nights because I wanted to die. But if you do not allow me to die, I said, then I take it, you still want me to continue, and your will be done. And so, on that day of the Lady of Fatima, May 30, 1975, I ended my fast. 5 years to the day, on May 5, 1980, and all because I wanted to wait for the burial of my doctor, they brought me out to the heart center. And then, on May 13, I was scheduled to have my triple heart bypass. 5 years to the day. I do not know the meaning of those coincidences. And so I told my doctor, hit me tomorrow because I will survive. And so I finished my operation and I was recuperating. And I cabled Mr. Marcos after my operation. I told him, operation has been successful. However, I developed a pericarditis. My doctors advised me 4 more weeks of convalescence. However, if you feel I should now return to my cell, I shall immediately take the first plane to go back to my cell. Mr. Marcos had General Ver call me and said, pinasasabi po ni Presidente, magpalakas na muna kayo dyan. Take your time, and when you are strong and ready, you can return. A week later, the international press came out with the story. Mr. Marcos extends indefinitely the stay of Aquino in America. On the basis of that report, I wired Harvard University and I said, I am now ready to accept the fellowship that you offered me. And Harvard University extended the invitation again to become a fellow at the Center for International Affairs. And that's the story. But I have no intention of seeking political asylum in America, as you know. I've always said that I shall return to the Philippines as soon as my Harvard fellowship is over, and I took it only because Mr. Marcos extended my stay indefinitely. But when I was convalescing, and I was receiving hundreds, thousands of letters from all over the world, America and the Philippines, Filipinos sending me $5 and $10 to help me in my hospitalization, sending me little money, token of money for my fellowship in Harvard. There was one underlying note in all of these letters. We waited for you for 8 years. Will you now abandon us? I am a human being, my friends. I have suffered 8 years of imprisonment. I have suffered loneliness like no other man has suffered loneliness in my life. I have been away from my children and my family, and I am financially ruined after 8 years. It is only instinctive for a man to look for his peace. And I debated with my mind, and I debated with myself, and I debated with my wife and my children whether I should go back to the arena of combat. I felt that I already earned my peace. I have done my best. I waited for 7 years and 7 months, and the Filipino people did not react. And they would even give me the impression that they loved their chain and their slavery. What can one man do if the Filipino people love their slavery? If the Filipino people have lost their voice and would not say no to a tyrant, what can one man do? I have no army, I have no following, I have no money, I only have my indomitable spirit. But the letters kept pouring in, and they said, we waited for you for 8 years. Will you now abandon us? And so with nostalgia, I recalled the situation in my prison. There in that prison, I shared a cell with a great Filipino. His name is Senator Jose W. Jokno, one of the most respected men in our country, a man who could not be bribed, a man whose towering integrity is a byword with the youth. He stayed with me for 2 years in jail, and then after 2 years he was released. No charges, no explanation. There were 100,000 Filipinos who went through those jails. Hardly 10% were charged. They were arrested without charges. They were released without explanation. That is what happened to our country. And what about the mothers and the children who lost their breadwinners when these people went to jail? In my compound, there were only 4 of us. Myself, Jose Maria Sison, his wife, and Lieutenant Corpus. I did not know that there was another one, a 5th one, who was barely 150 meters away from my cell. I never knew that there was a young man by the name of Sixto Carlos Jr. It was only when I was released that I finally read his poignant story. You know what they did to this man? They tortured him no end for 2 weeks. They kept him in a safe house. They fed him poison, and his body became numb. And finally, he lost his senses, and therefore they cannot bring him back to his family because they took him apart and they cannot put him back together. This young man was a student leader in the UP. He did not see the sun and the moon for 124 days. He was chained to his cot. Jose Maria Sison was chained to his cot. His feet was chained. His hand was chained. You cannot see a more inhuman situation. And I want to tell you, my friends, until you have tasted this loneliness, you will not know what solitary confinement means. They brought me to a mountain hideout in the Sierra Madre and placed me in a box. I had only my brief and my t-shirt. I refused to eat because I thought they were poisoning me. There was nothing in the room, barely nothing. And I had nothing to do but twiddle my thumb. And for the first time in my life, I heard the ticking of every second, and I was counting every second into minutes. And as the minutes marched into hours, and the hours into days, and days into weeks, I knew what loneliness meant. And therefore, as I thought back, that there are still many valiant Filipinos fighting for freedom, fighting for your right to speak. These are the people who are putting their lives on the line. These are people who abandon their loved ones and the comforts of their home, the wealth of their offices, to be able to bring freedom back and to be true to our founding fathers. And so I told my wife, much as we have found our peace and our freedom, I will have to return to combat. And so 6 weeks after my operation, I was still very weak. I went to Damascus, Syria, to meet with our Muslim brothers because I wanted to get to the root cause of this problem. 100,000 Filipino Muslims have already been killed. 300,000 are now refugees in Sabah. More than 20,000 Filipino soldiers have been killed in the last 8 years. And only 72 hours ago, 118 Filipino soldiers were massacred in Pada-Pada. And therefore, I wanted to go there, talk to our brothers in the Middle East, and plead with them to stop this carnage because we are all Filipinos. In spite of my weakness, I went to the MNLF hoping to find a solution. And when I came back to Dallas, Texas, I immediately took the telephone and I called Mr. Marcos and I told his Deputy Defense Minister, I went to Damascus, Syria, I talked to the Muslims, I did it on my own because I am aggrieved by the bloodshed that has occurred. Tell the President I have a formula. Maybe, I said, this is my way to help our people. Tell the President, I said, what he has done to me, I have already forgiven and I have already forgotten. I have no bitterness against Mr. Marcos. I have no rancor against Mr. Marcos. All I want to do is to help our people stop this bloodshed. So please tell the President, I said, I have a formula. In 2 days, I said, I will be sending him a formula. And I wrote this formula, a secret formula I sent to Mr. Marcos, and I said, Mr. Marcos, Filipinos are dying. And this is a possible breakthrough. What did Mr. Marcos do? He told the press that he sent me to Damascus, Syria as his agent and as his spy. And so I stayed on to recuperate in Dallas, Texas. Delegations upon delegations came to me. People whose name I cannot now tell you because their lives are in danger. They told me, Mr. Senator, they said, we have waited 8 years for you. Lead us. We are now ready. I said, with what? With water pistols? And said, no, sir, we are ready. They brought me to their training camps. They took me elsewhere, outside the United States, and showed me. Maybe we are a handful. Maybe we are few. But we are now ready to lay down our lives, and these are young Filipino boys and girls. These are boys and girls who come from the better families, who come from the better schools, but have now said, the time has come, we either put up or shut up. And so again, I entered into a long agony. Because I could not, for the like of me, condone violence. I told them, if you go into the road of violence, it will only lead to more violence, I said. If you kill one, Marcos will kill two, we kill three, and Marcos will kill four, and what will happen to our country? We cannot, I said, go to a road of violence. Because violence will only beget more violence, I said. And what will happen when 10,000 boys and girls are already dead in the streets of Manila and blood will be flowing in our very streets? I cannot, I said, resist the wailing of mothers who will now blame me that their children have died in the altar of freedom. But these young men were determined. They gave me only a few weeks to try to arrive at a solution with Mr. Marcos. And so, my friends, on August 4, much against my better judgment, I spoke in New York and I told Mr. Marcos, believe me, Mr. President, that if you do not lift your martial law, bombs will be bursting in Manila. Mr. Marcos called me insane. You know what he said? He should not have had his heart operation. He should have had his head operated. He did not listen to me. But I felt it was my duty, and as I said, I promised I will not speak out against the Marcos regime. But national interest now dictates that I must warn Mr. Marcos for the last time. I will walk the last mile to prevent this carnage, but if Mr. Marcos will not listen, so be it. And as you very well know, bombs exploded in the city. August, September, and October, and Mr. Marcos made me the mud bomber. I did not threaten him. I had nothing to do with the bombing. I only told Mr. Marcos and I warned him that the patience of the Filipino people have run out, and that if he does not yield now, then he shall reap the whirlwind. It is in that context that on December 16, Mrs. Marcos called me in the Waldorf Suite Towers. We spoke for 4.5 hours. I told Mrs. Marcos, I have no more political ambition, Mrs. Marcos. I told her that I'm through with politics. I told her that I am now a broken man, I said, and maybe this is the last time I'll see you. And she said, why? The last time I saw you, I had a broken heart. You call me now, I have a broken leg. Next time you'll see me, I'll have a broken neck. But I went to see Mrs. Marcos precisely to try to tell her of the imminence and the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Marcos said, are you willing to agree to a moratorium? Well, I said, Mrs. Marcos, who am I to agree to a moratorium? I'm not the mad bomber. And then she said, well, whatever it is, whether you're the mastermind or not, every time you speak in New York, bombs burst in Manila. So why don't you now appeal? I said, yes, Mrs. Marcos, I will appeal. I will appeal to the opposition in the Philippines, but for what? And for how long? Give us 6 months, she said. I said, maybe 90 days is more reasonable. I do not know, I said, whether they will follow me. But I will make my appeal to whoever is bombing in the Philippines to give you the chance. But what will you do? I promise you, she said, if you give us a moratorium, President Marcos will lift martial law. I said, you mean that? She said, yes. And as you very well know, a month after I met her, martial law was lifted. But what kind of lifting? And I told Mrs. Marcos. Mrs. Marcos, I said, if your husband is sincere, nothing is impossible. But if your husband is not sincere, nothing is possible. And believe me, I said, if you are not sincere, then the question is, how many will die? My friends, it is now February 15, and there's 1 month to go. I am not threatening Mr. Marcos. I am only reiterating my word of advice. If they do not increase the freedoms in our country, then I'm afraid that bombs will burst again. On February 1, last Saturday, I received a most poignant letter from a mother and a wife, and I'd like to read it to you. My dear Senator Aquino, thank you very much for remembering my husband in your negotiations with the government. I have written you a longer letter which will probably reach you in a few days. I am writing you now because I have just received word from my husband that he intends to go on a hunger strike starting Wednesday, February 4, starting with breakfast. The purpose of this is to protest his not being permitted to talk to his lawyers and his immediate relatives, me and my only son. I think he chose February 4 as the date of his hunger strike because he was caught on December 4, and by February 4 he would have been 2 months incommunicado. I understand that a number of other detainees accused of their involvement with the April 6 movement will also go on a sympathy strike, hunger strike, beginning February 4. Please pray for them. Thank you in advance for any help you can give me. Sincerely, Tina Montiel. Mr. Montiel was arrested on December 4. He has been kept incommunicado in the provincial command headquarters in Laguna. No lawyers have been allowed to see him. His wife and 4-year-old son went there, pleaded with the colonel, but they refused to allow him to see them. She went to the Deputy Defense Minister Barbero, and Minister Barbero gave a letter instructing the commander to allow the wife to see this man. Again, they did not allow. The suspicion is they've tortured him beyond recognition. That's why they cannot produce him, because there might be evidence. Today, the New York Times carried a long story on the saga of Rolando Montiel, that in spite of the lifting of martial law, there are still people held incommunicado in our land who are actually refused the very basic humanitarian consideration of seeing their lawyers and their family. What is so bad about seeing your wife and your children? I know exactly what Montiel is passing, because I also suffered more than a month, 2 months sometimes, without seeing my wife and my children, and the mental torture is terrific. This man is supposed to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, and therefore is entitled to the very rudiments of basic law. But no, under our martial law regime, he's still being held incommunicado. How many Montiels are there? How many unsung, unnamed Filipinos are still languishing in the jails of our land? In that blighted land of ours, where our founding fathers gave up their lives that we may see the morning sun. How many, my friends? And so while we are here in Los Angeles, in savoring the true meaning of freedom, laughing, enjoying, dancing our Valentine's Day, there are still many Filipinos pining away merely to have a chance, one glimpse of their wife and their children. I sent a cable to Mr. Marcos. The military went to one of the hunger strikers. They said, Montiel will already see his family. They stopped their strike. 6 days later, they found out they were fooled, and so they resumed their strike. Some of them are already on the 10th day of the strike. I know what it is to go on hunger strike. On the 10th day, my friend, your stomach will actually be only a handful. I know what it means. The hunger pains that you go on the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th day. I know the cramps in the stomach. I know when your hands start trembling and you feel cold because the fat in your body is wasting away. Many of our countrymen are in that predicament. I only hope and pray that Mr. Marcos will now heed to the last cable I sent this morning together with Senators Tañada and Manglapos, asking him in the name of God and humanity to stop the hunger strike by merely allowing Montiel to see his wife and children. I am not saying Montiel is innocent or guilty. All we are asking is that he be allowed to see his wife and his child and his lawyer. That's not asking too much. And yet, my friends, today, as we have this freedom rally, there are Filipinos deprived of those basic freedoms. I would like to reiterate, therefore, my stand. After almost 7 years and 7 months in prison, I have lost my appetite in office. I do not have any more the answers to the many solutions to our country. That's why I went to Harvard precisely to try to craft the many answers, the Malay of our society. I know for a fact we cannot go back to the old society where a few enjoy the fat of the land and the many suffered. But today, in spite of martial law, the rich are getting richer and the poor are growing in numbers. That cannot be. The meaning of our struggle is to be able to return the freedom. First, you must return the freedom, so that all segments of our community, whether from the left or from the right, will have the right to speak. And then in that open debate, in that clash of debate in the marketplace, we will produce the clash between the thesis and the antithesis, and we will have the synthesis for the Filipino people. I do not hold the key to our liberation. I do not know all the solutions to our many problems. All I know is that if the situation continues in the Philippines, then blood will flow. And when blood flows, there will be no victor and there will be no vanquished, because all of us will be the victim of our folly. I am therefore appealing to Mr. Marcos. Mr. Marcos, hear the cry of your people. You have been in office for 16 years. We do not want your blood. We do not want revenge. We do not want to hurt your family. We only ask that freedom be returned. We ask for nothing more, but we will accept for nothing less. We tell Mr. Marcos, you may have your exercise. I have said time and again, I'm no longer interested in politics. But if this will speed up the normalization of my country, if I must go back there again and sacrifice myself in a political arena, in spite of the fact that I have no money anymore to spend, if that will restore freedom, then I shall go back. And I tell you now, unless there are very grave intervening events, I shall return to Manila by June, at the end of my fellowship. What are the prospects? I have a death sentence waiting for me. I have been told by my lawyer, Senator Tañada, who arrived last week from Manila and went to Boston. He was called by Mr. Marcos to Malacanang the day before he left for America. And Mr. Marcos said, Danny, I want it very, very clear. I want you to explain this to Ninoy very carefully so that there will be no misunderstanding. If he returns to the Philippines, he will have to go back to jail. Senator Maceda went home to the Philippines and arrived 2 days ago. He had the same message. Padre, I have talked to the President. He told me that if you return to the Philippines, you will have to go back to jail. I am going back to the Philippines, and if I have to go back to jail, so be it. I believe that real suffering, bravely borne, melts even a heart of stone. I want to prove to Mr. Marcos that not only comfort and material things are the demands of the flesh, that there is an indomitable spirit that will be willing to take any sacrifices for our people. I shall therefore go back to the Philippines. And I shall bring back to myself the memory of this afternoon, where many of our kindred friends came to pay even hard money. But I only wish that when I'm back in my cell, that you'll give me a prayer and pray for those in similar situations. I believe that we cannot do it by force of arms because we have no arms. But civil disobedience becomes a sacred duty when the state has become lawless or corrupt. When a citizen who barters with such state shows it shares its corruption and its lawlessness. I refuse to share that corruption and lawlessness. I believe that when a government becomes corrupt, there is no other place for a good citizen but to be in jail. And therefore, I shall wear willingly again the hair shirt of imprisonment. But, my friends, this struggle can only mean victory for all of us. It will mean victory because we are different from those that we oppose. Those that we oppose are happy with the material wealth. But for how long? I have written Mr. Marcos letters upon letters, and I told him, read your history, my friend. I have no hatred for you. I only have pity, because if you do not see and you do not remove the calluses from your eyes, if you do not remove your blinders, you will meet the same fate of all the dictators of history. What happened to Mao Zedong? His wife is now in jail. What happened to Peron? Isabelita is now in jail. What happened to Franco? He's now forgotten. What happened to the Shah? For all of the things that he did, the monuments to his greatness have already been torn down. There has never been a single dictator in history that has lived forever. And so I tell Mr. Marcos, study the lessons of history before it is too late. It would be a tragic thing for a man to miss the right turn of the fork and end up as a great tragedy. I have read Mahatma Gandhi in prison, and I have read what he said. And this frail man, this man of almost 60 years old, barely 96 pounds, fought the entire British Empire and caused that empire to collapse. Why? Because he had an indomitable spirit. He had a moral spirit. He had the courage to stand against the British and tell them, you can end a man, you can imprison his body, but you cannot imprison his soul. And as long as man will refuse to be defeated, you are never defeated. And so Mr. Marcos can imprison my body, but my spirit shall soar, and it shall come to you here in Los Angeles to remind you that in your comfort and in your home and in your happiness here, there are still many people crying for liberation in your homeland. I shall return to the Philippines knowing that maybe the seeds that we have planted here today will bear fruit tomorrow. I realize the situation here. You have displayed tremendous courage. How many Filipinos are there in Los Angeles? There are more than 200,000 Filipinos here. But what is the common refrain? Ay, huwag kang magpunta ron, baka makunan tayo ng litrato, lagot na tayo sa bagong balikbayan. How many of our countrymen, my friends, your own neighbors will tell you, bakit ka naman pupunta ron, maghahanap ka pa ng sakit ng ulo. Kawawa naman yung kamag-anak mo sa Pilipinas. Don't they realize that by saying those words, they have condemned themselves? Because they are condoning tyranny. And when you condone tyranny, my friends, you share in its corruption and lawlessness. There are only two letters and one word that I will leave behind. The letter of N and O, and the word no. Because the ancient Greeks taught their people that the moment you can say no, then you are beginning to inquire. The moment you say no, you're beginning to protest. The moment you say no to tyranny, you are beginning the struggle, the long, lonely road to freedom. And so I ask, this afternoon, please say no and learn to say no. No to tyranny, no to corruption, no to all this degradation of human dignity. Because then, I feel you're the true heir of your fathers who before you have shed their blood for our freedoms. My friends, do not forget that your readiness to suffer will light the torch of freedom which can never be put out. Do not forget that we, who are now in the middle of our years, must inspire the youth when they are almost in the brink of despair. Do not forget that the purpose of life is precisely to examine our being, not merely be a floating flotsam in the floods of time. Do not forget, as Longfellow said, that we should never be like driven cattle, but be a hero in the strife. And so, as I ended my speeches before in the Philippines, meron pong isang kasabihan daw na merong isang lalaki na naglakbay sa malayo at siya'y inabot ng uhaw at halos siya'y mamatay na ng uhaw nung siya'y makakita ng isang silid. At si silid na yon ay nakakita ng isang magandang dalaga. At siya po ay humingi ng isang basong tubig. Binigyan ng dalaga ng isang basong tubig at ininom ng lalaking uhaw na halos mamatay. At sabi ng lalaki, magandang dalaga ikang ganon, hindi ko na po kakalimutan ang inyong itinulong sa akin. Nung ako'y uhaw na uhaw, ay kayo'y nagbigay ng tubig. With that, kinuha daw niya yung kanyang baso at kanyang ipinukol at binasag. Ay nagulat yung babae at sabi ng babae, kung kayo'y nagpapasalamat, kung kayo'y uhaw na uhaw at kayo'y tinulungan ko, ay bakit naman yung sinira yung aking baso at bakit yung binasag? Ang sagot daw po ng lalaki, binasag ko itong basong ito na parang wala nang ibang lalaki pang makakalapit ditong makikiinom sa inyo at gagamit sa ating maliit na baso. Ako po ay nagpunta rito sa inyo sa Los Angeles, bagamat ang aking paa ay napakasakit. Ako'y uhaw na uhaw sa pag-ibig at inyo'y binigay niyo ang inyong pag-ibig at kayo nagbayad pa na makadinig. At ngayon tayo may nagkakita at ako'y nagpapasalamat sa iyo, galak sa aking puso, sa buong pasasalamat ay sana'y basagin na natin yung basong tulong at pag-ibig na inyong binigay na parang wala ng Marcos na makakahiram pa sa balang panahon. My dear friends, I therefore would like to end this afternoon by saluting the courage that you have now displayed. And I'd like to tell you today, this courage have energized the batteries of my life, and I shall bring it to whatever fate will lead me. And I shall always remember the people of Los Angeles, and truly to me, it has become the city of angels. I thank you very much.
Why do you think that your returning to the Philippines will enhance the cause of freedom in the country?
That has been a question that has been asked to me because people think that I'm rather foolish to go back. Primarily, I do believe that we have to show some examples to our people. As Gandhi said, cowardice is infectious, but courage can also be infectious. We must show our people that there are times when we must sacrifice. It's very easy to be here in America. It's easy to become soft in America. Who does not want to enjoy this freedom? But so long as the Filipino people are suffering, I think it will be more meaningful if we can go back there and share that suffering. I do not believe, as I said, in a violent confrontation. I do not believe, as I said, that blood should flow. But who knows that by returning there and willingly sacrifice again imprisonment, I may be able to touch the conscience of Mr. Marcos. And in so doing, we'll be able to dialogue better with him and tell him exactly what some of our people feel. It may be foolish, but why should it be foolish? I'm only one. If I die, then I die, and there's only one to suffer. But so long as each one of us will be willing to take on the struggle, even if I am imprisoned, even if I die in prison, so long as you will continue the struggle and carry the torch, then I think we will have a better Philippines. Rather than have one carrying the torch, we'll have many. And that's my answer.
If you will become the next president of the Philippines, what will you do with the U.S. investments or big foreign investments in the Philippines?
That's a very, very good question, because there is a misconception that if the opposition wins in the Philippines, we will kick out all American foreign investments. But why would you do that? Foreign investments are in the Philippines to give employment to our people. We should watch against predatory foreign investors who are exploitative of the Filipino people. But I cannot accept that all foreign investments are exploitative. There are many foreign investments that are helpful to our country, because there are many foreign multinationals that have the technology which we do not have. We do not have the technology in digitals and computers. Who will teach us this? The idea is not to kick out foreign investment, but to regulate foreign investment so that it will be mutually beneficial to both countries. Where they become exploitative, they should be extirpated. But where they help the economy, they should be encouraged.
What relationship does the UNIDO party have to the National Democratic Front, who has played a central role in arguing the Filipino people's case against the Marcos dictatorship, and who presently has a base of support of over 10 million?
I do not know the actual relationship today between the United Democratic Opposition in the Philippines and the National Democratic Front. I've said in many of my writings that the National Democratic Front, especially its militant arm, the New People's Army, has been instrumental in many social changes in our country. There may be a difference in ideology and approach, but we are united in one. We are united against the dictatorship. My position is very clear. If we will succeed in overthrowing the dictatorship, we should allow every voice and every idea to ventilate their views in the public market. We should legalize the Communist Party of the Philippines and give them exactly the same forum to expound on their ideas. And once they've expounded their ideas and the Filipino people should opt them, then I think we should, in the spirit of democracy, accept majority rule. I will not accept a dictatorship of the right, much less will I accept a dictatorship of the left. But it should be the Filipino people in the ultimate sense who will judge which ideology and which cause that they should endorse.
You said violence begets violence, so it is just right to use violence against Marcos' regime, inasmuch as it is Marcos' main weapon.
I've always said that Mr. Marcos is the original terrorist. He is right now employing state violence. But if we use violence against him, he will only justify the use of more violence against us. And since he's a more violent man, he has more forces of repression, we will be the loser. In other words, as Gandhi said, if he uses violence against you, do not give him a reason to justify his violence. Because if you're not violent, then before the bar of public opinion and before God, he's the only sinner. One wrong does not right another wrong.
For Filipinos in the U.S., what do you propose for them to do to hasten the dismantling of the dictatorship in the Philippines?
For one, there is really very little that you can do. However, I hope that because the press in our country is controlled, every time you write your people back home, include some clippings that are found in American newspapers about what's happening back home. Do you know that yesterday, the Los Angeles Times had a story. 2,000 demonstrated in Manila. Nuns and priests were bombarded by water cannons. I talked to Manila only this morning. They told me not a single line of the story that has appeared in Los Angeles Times has appeared in Philippine press. Therefore, our people do not know what's happening. There was a clash in Sulu. We knew about it here, but in the Philippines, not a word was said in the newspapers. What can you do, therefore? When you send your monthly remittances, no matter how small, include the clipping so they will be enlightened.
How would you explain the severe poverty in the Philippines? Any alternatives? What are its roots and causes?
There is severe poverty in the Philippines, and this is endemic in the third world. I believe there is a structural defect in our system, as Mr. Osmeña pointed out. But I can only pinpoint to you one specific case. In the budget today, the budget of the national defense is almost 7 billion. And yet, if you add up the budget of education and culture, health and welfare, agrarian reform, and social welfare, they only add up to 6.2 billion. So that 4 major departments that are people-oriented have less budget than the armed force of the Philippines that has become the terrorists of our own people. The soldiers who are supposed to be our guardians have become our custodians. We are spending more money for bullets than for medicine. We're spending more money for tanks than for schoolhouses. We're spending more money for salary of soldiers than the salary of our teachers. That is one of the root causes of our fundamental poverty defect.
What role do you think the Reagan administration will play in the struggle for Philippine freedom?
I think this is a very vital role. President Carter, as you very well know, enunciated human rights policy. And I'd like to state here that beginning 1977, thousands of Filipinos were released from jail because of that Carter human rights policy. And Mr. Marcos was so pressured by the Carter human rights policy that there was a Harkin Amendment in the Congress. And this Harkin Amendment said, any country that consistently violates human rights will not receive American aid. And Mr. Marcos has been very dependent on foreign aid. If the Reagan administration will now turn its back from this policy and will put more emphasis on terrorism as against human rights, this may give a wrong signal to Mr. Marcos. It may only embolden him to carry out more of his repressive measures, because as some officials in the Carter and the Reagan administration have said, they may be violating human rights, but if they are our friends, we do not fight our allies. Now that can be a very wrong signal, and it can have a very adverse effect to our freedom cause.
Do you think Marcos still has a conscience after all this time? How can one reason with a monster?
No, sir. Mr. Marcos is a human being, and Mr. Marcos has a conscience. I may even concede that in his own fashion he thinks he's doing right. It is therefore our duty and our obligation to enlighten him. It is our duty and our obligation to tell Mr. Marcos that maybe he is wrong. But definitely, Mr. Marcos is a human being, and I have not lost hope that we can still reach him in the recesses of his conscience.
To Senator Aquino, people who claim to know you before martial law say that if you were elected president, you would have acted exactly, if not worse, than Marcos. Will you comment on this impression? Had 7 years of solitary confinement changed your political attitudes, character, and credibility?
I would like to begin with the first line of the sentence. People who claim to know you before martial law say that you, if you were president, you would act exactly, if not worse, than Marcos. The defect is in the first line. People who claim to know you, they don't know me.
According to the Boston Globe magazine, you call yourself a Christian socialist. Will Christian socialism help poor Filipinos?
What do I mean by Christian socialism? Very simply, Christian socialism means to me an equal opportunity for advancement and the full development of the human being. This means that the poorest person in the land must be given the equal opportunity for education. Not all men are created equal in their talents. Some are more brilliant than others. But we must give every citizen of the Republic the equal right and equal opportunity to quality education. That's number one. Number two, the Christian socialist believes that the great legitimizer of government is the ballot, not the bullet. And therefore, because we believe in the ballot, we believe in a majority rule. So that if the majority should opt and should win in a contest, then the minority should accept the majority mandate. But we put a culatilla, that the majority, even if it wins, must respect minority rights. Number three, we do not believe in the exploitation of man by man. Meaning, we do not believe in unbridled capitalism, where the rich will get richer and the poor will get poorer. In a developed country in America, you may have capitalism. But in a country like the Philippines, with very meager resources and a developing economy, we must harness our meager economy and maximize their benefit. And therefore, there should be centralized economic planning, and the government must actually give the direction as to prevent any overlap. Example, in the Philippines today, because it's profitable to have condominiums and profitable to have office buildings, all the millionaires in the Philippines are putting up all of their money in buildings and condominiums to the detriment of our industrial development. They go where the quick buck is. I believe that we should go where the long-range interest of the Filipino people is. Finally, I do not believe in the monopoly of basic industries. Why should one family monopolize one electric company in the Philippines? Or why should one family monopolize the ownership of one airline company in the Philippines? Or why should one company monopolize the telephone company in the Philippines? Since the government is funding all of this to begin with, these families are borrowing from government institutions and must depend on government guarantees. Then I say, let the government own them and let the people share in the profit. Christian socialism, therefore, is nothing more than democracy.
Since the forthcoming presidential election is a mockery once again and an insult to the people, may it not be fairly game if the lone presidential oppositionist to Marcos be Pascual Racoyal? And in a more serious vein, since you are not going to run for the May presidential election, who is your personal choice to run against Marcos?
I think I will join those who propose Mr. Racoyal.
Could Marcos retain his power if U.S. aid is withheld or decreased?
Yes, for a time he will be able to retain his power, but I believe that if the U.S. will continue to whittle down aid to him, he will not last as long as he will last if there is aid.
Marcos is said to be able to get access with the maps to the gold treasure the Japanese hid in the Philippines. What do you know about this? Could be one reason why Marcos would like to continue to be president of the Philippines.
I don't know about the gold of Mr. Marcos, and he has not told me about the maps that the Japanese left behind.
We don't want you to go back yet. Why don't you wait, just like Khomeini did in Iran?
I'm only 48. Khomeini is 78. That will be a 30-year wait. I don't think we should do that. I do not believe that it is within our reason to wait. We can accelerate time. What I'm trying to say is this. We should not depend on one man. We should depend on all of us. All of us are expendable in the cause for freedom. And therefore I say, stand up now and be a leader. And when all of us are leaders, we will expedite the cause of freedom.
What is the true story of Governor Lingad's murder?
I do not yet know the full facts of the murder of Governor Lingad. I was talking to the daughter of Governor Lingad last night, and I received certain information about the surroundings or about the antecedents or the facts surrounding the case. We are still looking into it. Our people in the Philippines are still trying to pinpoint the perpetrators of the dastardly crime. Suffice it to say that Governor Lingad died in the highest line of duty. And it's unfortunate that when he died, for 2 hours nobody would even touch his body. But in time, I think, our people will be able to appreciate the sacrifices that this man did at a time when nobody or hardly anybody wanted to pick up the cudgel.
Since you came over to the United States, have you yourself appealed or sought U.S. government's assistance in restoring democracy in the Philippines?
No, sir. I have never appealed to any American official or to any American to help us in our freedom. I believe that if we Filipinos cannot fight for our freedom, we do not deserve it. We should not depend on the Americans. We should depend on ourselves. All I told the Americans is, we are not asking you a single cent in our freedom struggle. All we are asking you is not to give, quadruple your military aid to the dictator so that our job will not be that much harder. The only thing I ask them is, desist from helping him and let us free ourselves.
From the audience, we would like to see Mrs. Aquino take a bow, the woman who is luckier than Imelda Marcos.
Mabuhay! Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Aquino, Senator Aquino has another appointment, and so he will have to be leaving. But in the meantime, again, it's very important that if you could please fill in the envelopes, and there will be ushers who will be raising their hands so that you could identify them. And thank you for your generosity. Thank you very much.